Welcome everyone to the Preschool Neuroscience Summit. Today I'm really excited to have Carla Tantillo Philibert with us. She is from Mindful Practices and she's going to be very interesting to talk to because she's has so much experience. She's worked with over 300 schools, over 100,000 children across Chicago where she lives, but also internationally, providing social emotional curriculum and planning, parent work, and community support, as well as yoga, mindfulness, and all kinds of things that I'm sure she's going to tell us about through her company, Mindful Practices. So we're really excited to have her here. She's also the author of Everyday SEL in Early Childhood, as well as several other books, which we will put links to, as well as her website and social media, so you can follow up with her after this summit if you're interested. And she's given us a free resource called Mindful Minutes, which are quick practices for students of all ages. So be sure to check that out. So welcome, Carla, and thank you so much for coming on today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be here.
Thanks. So tell us about how social emotional learning and mindfulness can be successful and really take root at the early childhood level.
Oh, what a great question. I think what's important to think about is first, our own internal narrative around this work. In many countries, in many cities across the globe, we see this work as important for maybe these kids or this age, and we often overlook our early childhood students. Our early childhood students are very resilient. And so we see them recovering quickly and we think, oh, they're not stressed, they don't need this. Or because they're not able to articulate or find words to voice those emotions that they're feeling, we say they're not stressed, they're not anxious. And so I think first off is saying at our schools or the communities and organizations where we work, what is the narrative around this work for early childhood students? And I know here for the Early Childhood Neuroscience Summit, right, I'm speaking to a lot of early childhood educators, but I think it's important, especially if your early childhood classroom or center is housed within a larger district, to say, like, what is the tone of this work in the larger organization or school district we serve, and then how can we advocate for this work on the same level that it's being advocated for in other grade bands. I think that's an important first step and one that often is overlooked. I think early childhood, many folks see it as, oh, well, students are already practicing social emotional learning because they're engaging in play, and so everything is taken care of, with a pretend kitchen in a dollhouse. Not so much, not so much. So again, like, how are we prioritizing social emotional learning and mindfulness, and why are we doing it? I think those are two really important pieces to start.
Yeah, for sure. And yeah, I love when all the early childhood advocates get together and change is coming.
Yes, it's coming.
Carla, tell us, what are your thoughts about kind of technology in the early years and how that impacts social emotional learning? Can it be helpful in instruction, or there's a lot of controversy around it, I guess, especially now with Zoom calls for preschoolers and stuff?
Absolutely. It can be helpful. And I think in the very next breath, being intentional and mindful about those practices. And so, for instance, we've done a lot of work with the University of Chicago using technology to solve for social emotional learning implementation problems. One of the implementation problems that we've seen is that teachers just don't feel like they have the time. And so they'll say, oh, students' social emotional learning needs are met here, here, and here, but they're never explicitly teaching social emotional learning, or they're never creating space for students to process emotions and for it to actually become a practice. And so in our work with the University of Chicago, we created a tool called Class Catalyst, where students check in with a caring adult in 3 minutes a day. And so that way they're able to check in, but also they're given a personalized practice. Because the second implementation problem that we found is that teachers will say, oh, and these are well-intentioned teachers, you know, huge hearts, who say, I do want to know what's happening with this child in my classroom. However, I'm not a trained social worker. And so there's almost this, I don't want to know. There's this willing suspension of disbelief. And that was never good enough for our students, but it's especially not good enough now in the context of a pandemic and the collective trauma that many of our students have experienced, the racial injustice that many of our students have experienced historically and continue to experience. And so we have to solve for those two things: lack of time and lack of teacher bandwidth to address the emotions that may come up. And so what we did is we created a technology tool that does this. It gives students and teachers a way to check in confidentially in a student's own words, or by, you know, clicking on little emoticon faces. And then also by giving students practices, by differentiating according to student need. Now, this is different in the social emotional learning landscape, because what many social emotional learning tools do is they look to assess student mastery of SEL, right? Or we screen students. All right. So can we, you know, crack open the head of a 4-year-old and look in there? Oh yeah, they're not depressed or sad. They're really morose. Like, what? You know?
Exactly.
Yes, this semantic argument, I think, you know, in my mind, is a fool's errand and not really the end game of the work. The end game of the work is to give our students the tools to be self-aware. Say, oh, my tummy hurts. And when my tummy hurts, this, that, or that may be going on, right? And that comes with practice over time. So with our research with the University of Chicago, that's what we found, is the power is in the practice. Technology is great for this delivery. However, then we get to this other piece. Are we gamifying the technology that we want our students to use? And if we're gamifying that technology, then this is where I feel that we are not using practices that are educationally sound for students. In fact, we're using practices that we know are addictive when it comes to technology. So for instance, if at the end of our tool, Class Catalyst, the students built a candy castle, right? Or they were able to like dress up a little doll online or whatever it may be. And that was 6 minutes or 60 seconds. What we're doing is we're getting the students addicted to the technology.
Yeah.
And I am using strong words here, I'm aware. However, I see so many tools in the early childhood space and in the elementary space where we're looking at usage, we're looking at engagement, and we're using words like engagement that work in the educational context, but I think are misused in the ed tech space. And so in our tool, we intentionally did not gamify it. There's no candy castle, there's no token that they get. The point of the tool is explicit for the students as well as the teachers. Here's your moment to check in. Here's your moment to practice mindfulness. And then you're off the tool, engaging face-to-face with an adult. So the tool is the window. The engagement of the tool is not the end game. So to answer the question, when we're looking at technology, I think we have to do so soberly and say, what is the point of this tool? Is the point of this tool to keep our early childhood students on this, engaged in this tool for minutes on end, building a candy castle? If that's the case, that's not an instructionally sound practice, especially for early childhood. Does this tool solve for a problem like time or teacher bandwidth? If that's the case, then use it, right? There are tools out there, there are tools out there in the ed tech space that can help solve for problems. Like if there's only one teacher, there's 28 students. This is where you use technology. If those 28 students are on the tool building a candy castle for 13 minutes, we're using technology the wrong way.
Yeah, so important to kind of really dig in and see what we're using in classrooms and why, right? And what the outcomes are. So tell us, obviously lots of people on this summit will be passionate about social emotional learning, but just tell us a little bit about why you feel and what the research says about why it's so important in this age range to teach social emotional skills.
Thank you for that, because I'm very passionate about social emotional learning with early childhood students. Again, I think early childhood curricula is perfectly poised for social emotional learning because of play, because of the setups of classrooms often for early childhood students. But I do think that sometimes we assume that those social emotional learning competencies are already built in, versus taking a moment to explain to students the why behind the social emotional learning work. And I think that's critical, that's huge. Because what we want is we want students to be able to find, as Viktor Frankl says, that space between stimulus and response. And that becomes, there's automaticity to that, there's practice to that. And they develop that as early childhood students. So then over time, when they're 8, when they're 16, when they're in post-secondary, they have that skill, it's practiced. So they find when they're dysregulated, that there's a practice they can use to get back online, to get ready to learn, whatever words we're using with our students. And I think so often what happens is that is cued to a student by an adult saying, oh, Carla, you're acting XYZ. You need to go to the calm down corner or the cool down corner. And so it's not something that the student identifies in themselves. It's something that an adult, often a caring adult and a well-intentioned adult, but that adult identifies for them. While that may help in the moment with the adult's classroom management or what we have on the schedule for the day, that doesn't help the learner over time. Because what we want in the power of social emotional learning is for a student to be able to cultivate that awareness of self, where they're like, okay, I'm feeling anxious, I'm feeling stressed, I'm feeling sad, or just I'm feeling in my body a certain way. And that certain way tells me that I need to practice a lion's breath, or I need to doodle on a page, or I need to do 6 jumping jacks. Truthfully, the practices component we care about. But if a student says, I want to do jumping jacks instead of a mindful breath, great, do the jumping jacks. Right? Because what we've done is we see that student with agency, we see that student with voice, and early childhood is not too young to start cultivating that agency, and that comes with practice over time.
Yeah, I love that. So Carla, why is it then that so many schools fail at kind of bringing this in? What is it that's, just not working?
Another great question, Helen. Thank you. So I think there's 2 problems. One, we look for easy. And in early childhood, there are many tools and platforms that are thrown to teachers that are easy. Here, go to this website and click on this thing and have all the students stand on the rug and dance together or do yoga together, right? There's no body awareness that's being cultivated. There's no interpersonal relationships that are being cultivated. And we're using technology to entertain students. And so they're not aware of the body, they're aware of what's happening on the screen. And so we have to soberly look at what tools we're using and why. If we're using that little web platform to have all the students wiggle together on the carpet because we need a minute, then great. Or they need a movement break, sure, but let's call that a movement break and let's not pretend that is social emotional learning, because there's no cultivation of self-awareness and there's no self-regulation. There's no body awareness if there's 20 students smushed together on a rug looking at a screen. And so I think we have to be real and about the tools we're using with students. And so the second part of that is also being real about training that we're providing educators. When COVID happened, so many of our clients would say, well, I don't understand it. My teachers were trained in this prepackaged curriculum or this prepackaged curriculum. So why is it now that they're not able to connect with their students? They're not able, the interpersonal piece is missing, the intrapersonal piece. Why is that? And I said, because you trained them in how to deliver lessons in a curriculum. You didn't train them in social emotional learning as a discipline. And that's the difference. And so again, we have invested money as schools across the country, across the globe, in great, solid curricular programs. Yes, but that doesn't also mean that we have trained our teachers in social emotional learning, and we're seeing that lack of transference. We're seeing that's not translating. So we have to be honest and say, what do we need to do to empower our teachers to engage in students in this way, especially now when so many of our teachers their own well-being, their own self-care feels inaccessible. And so we have to train our teachers in cultivating awareness of self and in the ability to regulate those pro-social pieces. And when we do that for our teachers and we train them in those social emotional learning competencies for them, then as a learner, they're able to teach that from a much richer, a much more authentic place. When we think about mindfulness, which is a vehicle to of course, access social emotional learning, right? Mindfulness and social emotional learning aren't the same thing, but mindfulness is a practice that can help adults and students alike cultivate awareness of self. Again, if we want our students to engage with this practice, then we need to create space for our teachers to practice as well.
Yeah. So important. And often the big missing piece, right? Is the modeling and the kids just absorb. They're so smart, right?
They're so smart. I know.
So Carla, could you share maybe some practical ideas or some suggestions of what this might look like and in the classroom on a practical level?
Absolutely. So I think looking again as an educator or practitioner or an administrator, start working backwards mapping, right? What is our end goal? And having that end goal is the North Star. The end goal for me is agency. When a student says to you, oh, Miss Carla, this happened over the weekend and I found my mindful breath. We've crossed the finish line. We're done, right? We say, yay, and we high five because that student has agency. They identified the need, and then they had a practice that was accessible to them, a practice that wasn't dependent upon me as the adult to facilitate, wasn't dependent upon clicking a platform so they could all wiggle on the rug together, right? Instead, it was practiced over time. And so it was accessible to that student without an adult, without certain props or supplies, etc. And so that's my North Star in the work that I do with school districts across the globe. That may or may not be other folks' North Star. However, you need to have one. We need to know what we're working to. It can't be social emotional learning for social emotional learning's sake. And so what does that look like? Then the secondary piece is, if that is the North Star, how do we train our teachers, as you said, to be able to model that? And to be able to model that, there has to be space for them to practice that, for them to be able to cultivate their own awareness of self, their own ability to regulate. Even though I do this work for a living and I've written 6 books on it, put me with my mother-in-law for a week around the holidays, my own ability to regulate isn't there, right? Isn't accessible. So I think that this work is so contextualized. That's a piece that we have to keep in mind as well. And that's where the power of practice over time comes. With the research we've done with the University of Chicago, that's the sweet spot. That's the piece. And so that gets to my last, piece of advice, if you will, is where is the time going to be? While I think it's great to embed your social emotional learning competencies into your day-to-day curriculum, that's beautiful, that's wonderful. However, there is a difference between teaching social emotional learning during non-instructional time, when I first come in the room as your student, or when you and I first connect online, right? That important intrapersonal, that opportunity there during non-instructional time is different than social emotional learning competencies embedded during instructional time, where I'm reading the story Jabari Jumps and I'm stopping on the page where he's fearful to go off the high dive, and I talk about fear and have you ever felt fear, etc. Is that teaching social emotional learning? Absolutely, but that's in an instructional context, and that's different than the non-instructional side. So if we're saying to teachers, you need to model awareness and regulation, build those interpersonal relationships, as John Hattie said, that's where our bang for our buck is, then we, when we're creating our school schedules, have to say, we are going to make time for that non-instructional work. We are going to say, that's so important. Here's 5 minutes, here's 7 minutes, here's 10 minutes. Now, there are programs out there where students are in the circle and they all say how they're feeling. That is great. However, that has limitations as well. There are students who aren't comfortable sharing verbally. there are students where they may share something in that larger group context where they need additional support. And so what does that additional support look like and sound like? This is why, again, we built our Class Catalyst tool, because so many teachers were finding if they were doing a group share in a circle, a student would say, I lost grandma, I'm hurting myself or others. Things are being shared, especially with our early childhood students without much of a filter.
Yeah, exactly.
And so, yes. And so then the teacher would say, oh, wow, this is either taking more time and or I'm not sure what my next steps are. So I'm going to get rid of this non-instructional time. And I'm only going to go with teaching in SEL in the instructional context. So that's why we preserve that non-instructional time for the student check-in. And then we also have a game plan, whether it's using a tool like mine or coming up with connections with the school social worker or the counselor, but knowing when a student does share something that it's mandated that we share, or we know just in the best interest of the child that we share, that a game plan is ready to go. Because what we don't want to happen is we don't want our teachers to get scared away from that non-instructional connection because they don't feel they have the tools in their toolbox to necessarily handle what may come up during that time.
Yeah. Woo, so important. I love it, Carla. And yeah, I mean, it's really something that we all need to kind of work on together and fight to get that time for teachers to develop these skills and you know, not after a whole day of work, but you know, integrated within their profession. You know, we see so many teachers leaving the profession because of stress and overwhelm, and I just think, you know, these kind of things will just help with all sorts of outcomes, like keeping these great teachers in the profession as well. So thank you so much for coming on and sharing today. I really appreciate you sharing all that great information and knowledge about all the different things that you're doing. I just want to remind everyone we'll have all the website and social media links for Carla, as well as the free resource Mindful Minutes and links to her book. So thanks again for coming on and sharing with us today.
Oh, well, thank you again. It was absolutely my honor. Did I answer all your questions? I know. Yes.
Yes.
Did. Okay, great.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah, I
great,
think
great.
I could talk to you all day. But,
I know, me too. Can we get coffee at some point? Because
I know. I'll have to come to Chicago.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I did want to share, I told my editor that I was going to be coming on, and she did say that the early childhood book and the elementary book, that she would give bulk discounts to anyone that was interested in ordering.
Oh, okay, awesome. Okay, so we'll put the link to that as well. Great.
Yes, yes.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, and thank you, participants.
Yeah.